If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Houghton, and welcome. Today, we're stepping into the brilliant and unpredictable mind of Virginia Woolf, a writer who didn't just write novels, but rewired what the novel could be. From the hush of Mrs. Dalloway to the luminous fragments of To the Lighthouse, I think she actually broke open her time, memory, and identity. And she really asked what it meant to be a woman navigating the world that she never asked for, but inherited all the same. Why does she still matter? Well, because she didn't shout. She rewrote. She gave us new ways to think, to feel, to read, and to write. In her life and her work, she questioned absolutely everything: gender, power, war, and art. And this episode is a journey through her life, her loves, her struggles, and the legacy of a mind that never stopped pushing at the edges. Woolf didn't just leave us novels, she left us blueprints for resistance, for introspection, for clarity in what was a chaotic world. Clarity that is actually for this chaotic world. And look, whether you're meeting her for the first time or returning with fresh eyes, she actually asks us to slow down and to pay attention, to listen. And in today's noise, that might be the most radical act of all. So I've just finished reading Square Haunting by Francesca Wade, a book that lingers almost like smoke in a winter room. It draws us into Woolf's Bloomsbury years alongside other four radical women, H.D. Doolittle, Dorothy Sayers, Jane Harrison, and Eileen Power, who all lived and worked in Mecklenburg Square. Wade captures not just the shifting alliances of the Bloomsbury group, but the heat of Virginia's mind, her passionate affair with Vita Sackville-West, and the long shadow of mental illness that shaped and sometimes threatened to unravel her genius. Woolf is a writer you don't need. You live with her. Her sentences, they shimmer differently every single time. Her voice ranges from sly to savage, ethereal to blunt. She didn't just move through Bloomsbury. She challenged it, she provoked it, and I think she actually loved it fiercely. And always with Woolf, it's the writing that stops you, the sentence that shows you something you've never seen, that finds the words for the feeling that you haven't yet named. So let's begin. Let's go back before the brilliance and the breakdowns, before the salons and the sentences, because to understand Virginia Woolf, you actually have to understand the house that made her. She was born in 1882 at 22 Hyde Park Gate, Kensington, into the plush, restrictive heart of Victorian respectability. From the outside, it was a home of proprietary. Her father, Sir Leslie Stephen, edited the Dictionary of National Biography, a monument to great men. I have to say, if you have insomnia, it's a very good read. The irony, of course, is delirious. One of his daughters would actually grow up to set that complete narrative on fire. In fact, not just set it on fire, to actually burn that house down. And of course, I'm speaking metaphorically. Woolf never escaped that house, not really. It kind of shows up again and again in her fiction, not as a ghost story, but as atmosphere. It's oppressive, it's heavy, the furniture is smothering, the morality is suffocating. You know, the curtains don't just block out the sunlight. I think they actually swallowed her joy. But in that dark house, something quiet had already begun, a rebellion just beneath the surface. Unlike their brothers, Virginia and her sister Vanessa weren't sent to school. That quiet exclusion left a deep, permanent mark. The boys were educated. The girls were expected to sit still and be ornamental. That casual, structural injustice became one of the great engines of Woolf's rage, and also, I think, her brilliance. So she educated herself with a hunger, I think, that bordered on obsession. She devoured everything she could find. And here, her father, blind to gender inequality, but generous in one crucial way, he actually gave her access to his vast personal library. The room of books became her universe, her cathedral in a way, and that became her rebellion. She read the Greek classics. She read poetry, philosophy, novels, history, treaties, obscure pamphlets. Later, in her sharp, kind of sly way, she also wrote on not knowing Greek, which was an incredibly powerful reflection on what women lost by being locked out of classical learning. That sense of brilliant but unwelcome, that outsider's ache, it never left her. And I think it shaped her thinking. It made her dangerous in the best possible way. Let's be clear, though. Virginia didn't grow up poor. She was incredibly privileged. But hers was very much a gilded cage, and she knew it. Her brothers had ladders. She built her own, rung by rung. Yes, she attended King's College London, but only in the segregated ladies' department. It was her restless intellect, not the system, that actually shaped her. And Vanessa? Vanessa Stephen became Vanessa Bell, painter, icon, and visual heartbeat of the Bloomsbury group. And the sisters were wired to each other. They were connected. Virginia had words, Vanessa had color, and together they redrew the rules of art, literature, and life. Then everything changed. Virginia and Vanessa were still teenagers when it happened. First, their mother died, a crushing loss. Then, not long after, their father followed. 2 deaths in quick succession. Not the kind that break a family, but the kind that actually remake it entirely. Suddenly, the 4 Stephen siblings, Vanessa, Virginia, Toby, and Adrian, were unmoored. But from that grief actually came something completely unexpected: freedom. They didn't linger at Hyde Park Gate. That house had always felt like a mausoleum, and now there was nothing to stop them from walking away from it. Vanessa, ever the strategist, is said to have spread the map of London and pointed to the most unorthodox corner she could find. And what they found was an area guaranteed to scandalize their parents' old friends, Bloomsbury. Today, Bloomsbury conjures literary magic, but back then, it was unfashionable, it was slightly shabby, and probably deeply uncool, which made it absolutely perfect. They claimed number 46 Gordon Square with quiet defiance. It was a practical move, yes, but it was also a symbolic one. West London stood for silk gloves and social performance. Bloomsbury, on the other hand, promised looser rules and wider horizons. Its old Georgian houses were being divided, rented out cheaply, stripped of their grandeur. And in that openness, the Stephens found space to breathe. For Virginia, I think it was seismic. Her first real step out of the patriarchal shadow and into something that was raw and uncertain and entirely her own. I don't think they just changed addresses. I think they changed identities. Out went the ancestral portraits and choking furniture. In came white walls, Vanessa's paintings, light, and more importantly, conversation. The house filled not with heirlooms, but with people. Artists, economists, philosophers, writers, lovers. What we now call the Bloomsbury Group wasn't a club or a manifesto. It was a gathering of a like-minded tribe, a collision of minds daring to say what respectable London wouldn't even whisper. And Virginia, it was actually the beginning. She didn't just find her people, she began to find her voice. At Gordon Square, nothing was off limits. Sex, politics, art, philosophy. If it mattered, they talked about it openly, passionately, and without the corset of Edwardian manners. It might sound tame now, but in the early 20th century London, this was radical, especially when women were speaking. And around the Stevens sisters, Virginia and Vanessa, something absolutely remarkable began to take shape. The Bloomsbury Group, fluid, brilliant, quietly subversive. Now, I did a whole podcast on the Bloomsburys last year, so I don't want to trace every twist here, but the spark that began with their brother Toby. He was a Cambridge man, part of the secretive Apostles Club, and Toby moved in circles of sharp, serious thinkers. G.E. Moore was their lodestar, and he preached truth and beauty and friendship as the highest ideals. These weren't just ordinary dinner guests. There was Clive Bell, who ended up marrying Vanessa and became one of the era's leading art critics. There was Leonard Woolf, intense, steady, who would marry Virginia and become her fiercest ally in life and in print. There was Lytton Strachey, wickedly funny and razor-tongued, who literally tore down Victorian hero worship in his Eminent Victorians. There was John Maynard Keynes, yes, that Keynes, who rewrote economic theory and completely shaped the post-war world. And then there was Duncan Grant, the painter who became Vanessa's lifelong partner in art and in love. That was the core group, but this orbit expanded and included figures such as E.M. Forster, Bertrand Russell, Desmond McCarthy, Saxon Sidney Turner. Even Dorothy Parker would drop in on the group when she was in town. Bloomsbury wasn't a manifesto. It was a mood. It was a belief that conversation could be a form of creation, that ideas mattered, that beauty and intellect could actually shape the world. And in that belief, this group sparked a cultural explosion, a big bang, if you like, of modern thought. You know, while Vanessa studied at the Slade School of Art, surrounded by painters, chasing the invisible, motion, emotion, modernity, Virginia was still searching for her voice. The house absolutely would have buzzed with energy. The air would have smelled of tobacco, of turpentine, and I think more importantly, of possibility. People argued and laughed and wept and kissed and created and loved. And nights blurred into mornings, books, brushes, talk, tea. This was the place where you wanted to be. This wasn't polite drawing room chatter. These were very, very urgent attempts to make a sense of a world that felt like it was cracking open. Look at the similarities of that then and today. Incredible, really, isn't it? So what united them? Well, in one word, curiosity. And the belief that the world didn't have to be inherited as it was. It could be imagined anew. They weren't throwing Molotov cocktails. They were lighting candles and having conversation. The effect was just as explosive. Virginia, still at the edge of her literary life, absorbed everything. She began writing anonymously, actually book reviews for the Times Literary Supplement. Modest beginnings, but monumental. Her thoughts, her words, published, paid for, taken seriously. You don't understand how important this was for a woman at this time. It was, in its quiet way, an absolute earthquake. Because for Virginia, writing wasn't just expression, it was emancipation. But she wasn't the only writer in the room. As her voice took shape on the page, she actually stepped into the broader world of activism and protest. She aligned herself with the growing suffrage movement. Feminism for her wasn't abstract, it was intimate. The right to think, to speak, to be heard. These weren't slogans. These were necessities. And of course, then, just as her world began to open, it fractured. Her beloved brother, Toby, who had first brought the Cambridge apostles into their lives, died very suddenly of typhoid. He was very young, and it was very cruel. Vanessa and Virginia, who had already just lost their parents, were absolutely devastated, and Toby's death left a void that nothing could quite fill. Soon after, though, Vanessa married Clive Bell and left the house to start a family of her own. Gordon Square, once alive with ideas and intimacy, suddenly began to feel very hollow, and I think probably too hollow. Virginia stayed close to her brother Adrian, and for a time the two lived together. But someone new was actually entering her orbit, fresh from a colonial posting in Ceylon, carrying suppose, the dust and the doubts of empire. And that man's name was Leonard Woolf. Leonard was steady, he was serious, he was deeply thoughtful, and he proposed. Now, this wasn't some sweeping romantic gesture. Virginia had already turned down several proposals from within the Bloomsbury circle, including one from Lytton Strachey, who immediately regretted it despite being entirely unsuited to marriage. He was gay, and they both knew it, and they laughed about it later in that I can only imagine that deliciously dry Bloomsbury way. But Leonard's proposal was very different. It asked more of her. Virginia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she wrote him a letter, and in it, she laid herself completely bare. No disguises, no pretense. She told him she cared deeply for him, but felt no physical desire for him. And she wasn't offering a traditional marriage. She said, "I will not look on marriage as a profession." And that sentence is actually charged with defiance. Marriage for Virginia wasn't a goal. It wasn't a gamble. It was a structure that could either trap her or set her free. And then this. She writes to Leonard, "If you can still go on as before, letting me find my own way, as that is what would please me best, then we must both take the risk. We both of us want a marriage that is a tremendous living thing, always alive, always hot, not dead and easy and parted, as most marriages are. We ask a great deal of life, don't we? Perhaps we shall get it. And then, how splendid." Virginia wasn't offering comfort. She was offering truth. And I think to his great credit, Leonard said yes. They married in 1912, and it wasn't easy. It was unconventional, often intense, sometimes stormy, but it became the most enduring, grounding relationship of Virginia's life. So then I wondered, what did that partnership look like on a day-to-day basis? And how did it shape her writing that was to follow? The letter gives us a glimpse, not of a literary icon, but of a woman daring to reach for something rare. A marriage built not on roles or ritual, but actually a marriage that was built on freedom. A relationship that stayed always alive, always hot, as she described it. I think it's bold. I think it's vulnerable, and it tells us everything that we need to know about who Virginia really was. And that is restless, idealistic, unwilling to settle for anything less than the whole complicated truth. So then I wondered, what was she really like? Virginia Woolf is often remembered in stark outlines, the austere genius, the fragile figure with a sharp profile, drifting, through the fog of her thoughts. But interestingly, those who actually knew her paint a far more vivid picture. She was witty. She was an electrifying conversationist, a gossip lover with razor-sharp humor, curious almost to the point of obsession. She could be intimidating, yes, but I think she was also magnetic, full of sudden laughter and unpredictable charm. And beneath that brilliance, I think ran a very deep current. Virginia lived with what we now recognize as bipolar disorder. Her mental health struggles were intense and reoccurring. The highs brought manic energy, racing thoughts, bursts of creativity. The lows were crushing. Silence, collapse, despair. In those early years of a marriage, these breakdowns came very frequently, often triggered by stress, overstimulation, and I think also the sheer pressure of having to create. Leonard, in many ways, became more than a husband. He became her guardian, her sentinel. He monitored her moods. He managed her rest. He oversaw her medications. And he did everything he could to protect the fragile line between her genius and her unraveling. Yes, their marriage was unconventional, but look, it was rooted in loyalty. And on Leonard's part, I think extraordinary devotion. In 1915, hoping to escape the noise that seemed to aggravate her illness, they actually left London for Richmond. But the quiet also didn't suit her. Not really. Virginia loved people. She thrived on energy, ideas, voices, on, I can only imagine, long wine-soaked dinners and endless conversations that spiraled, late into the night. Her diaries actually crackle with life, literally, gossip, guests, arguments, and, literary salons. And I think more than anything, she actually loved London. She loved the essence of London. To Virginia, London wasn't a setting, it was a character, a muse. She wrote about the city with absolute rapture, the gleam of wet pavement, the blur of strangers in motion, the mysteries behind a lit window, on a foggy evening. In her work, London absolutely pulses. It's alive, it's chaotic, it's luminous. But always there is the tension, the pull of the world, and the equally urgent need, I think, for her need to retreat from it. Virginia needed people, but she also needed solitude like oxygen. That duality, sociability and silence, became the rhythm of her creative life. And then the world shattered, didn't it? The First World War shattered the illusions of the Edwardian age. It pierced the optimism of the Bloomsburys. It left behind something darker, more fractured. And many in the group, Leonard included, were pacifists. Several of them became conscientious objectors, choosing to work the land rather than take up arms, which was an option. For Virginia, the war wasn't just bloodshed, it was a rupture in the moral fabric of society. She saw it as the inevitable outcome of systems built on conquest, of dominance and control, empire, patriarchy, the old boys' club of history. War to her was a symptom of something deeper, something rotten in the roots of power. And I think it helped her feminism sharpen. She asked harder questions. Who makes the rules that send men to war? Why are women locked out of those decisions? Why is history always told by the victors and always by men? These questions echoed through her work, personal, political, and deeply philosophical work and thinking. And they actually reached a blistering bloody peak in 3 Guineas. Look, I'll be honest with you, it's not an easy read, but my God, it's fierce, it's brilliant, it's relentless. And in it, Woolf turns her pen into a blade. Her enemy isn't just inequality, it's militarism. She argues that the same system that trains men for war also keeps women silent. Hierarchies, obedience, empire. And she asks scandalously, should women support men's education if it only trains men for violence? And this isn't just parlor room feminism. It's pointed, it's radical. And it wasn't just in her essays. War haunted her fiction too. In Mrs. Dalloway, there's a character there called Septimus Smith, who walks the same streets as Clarissa, but he's trapped in a post-war hell. His mind is unraveling. And what Woolf does is she takes us inside his fractured psyche and absolutely refuses to look away. The war may be over, but not for him and not for thousands like him. In To the Lighthouse, she does something quieter, more haunting. The war isn't mentioned outright. Instead, it arrives as absence. So rooms are emptied, lives are gone. There's silence where people once were. The world falls apart, but off stage. And I think it's one of the most powerful descriptions of loss in modern 20th century literature. To fully grasp the force of these novels, though, we actually need to take a step back, just to dial it back a little, because Woolf wasn't just responding to her time, she was actually reinventing the form itself. The Victorian novel, with its, tidy plots, felt entirely false to her. Life isn't linear, and it didn't unfold in very neat little chapters. It paused. It pauses still, it flickers, it's blurred. So she tore down the old model, and she built something entirely new. Virginia Woolf famously wrote, on or about December 1910, human character changed. It sounds really dramatic, right? But she actually meant it. The modern world was in flux, and she believed that literature had to catch up, and she was going to be that driving force. Her first two novels, The Voyage Out and Night and Day, still carry the bones, to be honest, of Victorian tradition. But even then, she was kind of pushing at the form. Themes of female isolation, shifting identity, and the quiet mysteries of, ordinary life were already taking root. And then, of course, came Jacob's Room. And oh my God, that changed absolutely everything. It's not a novel in the conventional sense. Jacob Flanders, the central figure, is more ghost than protagonist, seen only through the impressions of others. And the book is a collage of glimpses, memoirs, and absences. It's elegy in motion, a mediation on how unknowable people are and how war obliterates even the fragments that we might have held onto. With Jacob's Room, Woolf didn't just step into modernism, I think she claimed it. By then, of course, she wasn't just a novelist, she was a literary thinker. Her essay, Modern Fiction, laid it bare. This tightly plotted Victorian novel, with its clean cause and effect structure, real life doesn't unfold in near arcs. It flickers, it pulses, it's made of impressions and not resolutioned. And she championed what she called moments of being, brief flashes of awareness that pierce the everyday fog and actually show us something real. These luminous instants, not the scaffolding of plot, oh no, were where she believed truth lived. From Jacob's Room onwards, that's what she chased. Not what her characters did, but more what her characters felt. How thought meanders, how memory slips, how I suppose the outside world leaves bruises on the inner self. Her novels became complete vessels for consciousness itself. And we don't follow her characters through the streets. We actually follow them through their minds. This is what makes her stand out. And, in doing so, Woolf actually rewrote the novel from the inside out. Jacob's Room was an absolute breakthrough, but it wasn't a bestseller. Virginia was gaining respect in literary circles, but fame actually came to her rather slowly. And the truth is, publishing never ever sat easily with her. She was always caught between two worlds, the quiet control of solitude and then the unpredictable exposure of kind of public life. She absolutely longed to be read, to be understood, but handing her work to editors, to critics, to strangers, it thrilled and terrified her, I think, in equal measure. That tension between retreating and recognition runs through her writing and actually through her entire life. During the war, she and Leonard moved to Richmond and launched their own press, the Hogarth Press. And they did it because it was part protection, part revolution. They printed her books themselves on a press, actually in their dining room. There were no gatekeepers, there's no interference, just the freedom to create on her own terms. And that mattered deeply because in 1920s Britain, a woman publishing experimental fiction wasn't just rare, it was radical. The literary world, even in modernist circles, was overly male-dominated. And what's interesting is when men broke narrative conventions, it was actually considered genius. When women did it, it was discussed as difficult, or worse, it was actually dismissed. Mrs. Dalloway is often read as Virginia's answer to Ulysses. Not imitation, but dialogue. What if, instead of epic quests, you actually followed a woman through a single day? What if the stakes were memory, regret, perception? What if plot wasn't actually the point? Virginia wasn't just keeping pace with modernism, she was actually reshaping it, from the margins, from the drawing room, from the mind of a woman who refused to be anything but brilliant, absolutely brilliant on her own terms. There's a line in A Room of One's Own that I've never really forgotten, but if I don't have it verbatim, don't crucify me for it, but it says something like this. If a book is about war, it's called literature. But if it's about people talking in a drawing room, it's dismissed. And you know what? That was actually Woolf's battleground. She saw the double standard clearly. Men's stories were universal, women's stories and lives were trivial. And her entire career pushed back against that idea. That's why the Hogarth Press was more than just a workaround. It was a shield, a platform, a declaration of independence from a system that might never have let her in. And looking across Virginia Woolf's body of work, one question always surfaces to me. It's like, what was her greatest achievement? And of course, it's a very personal thing. She believed it to be To the Lighthouse. She once said she composed it while walking the streets of Tavistock Square, shaping it in her mind before even writing it down. And the novel is actually steeped in memory and longing. And it's deeply, deeply personal. Her parents are in it, thinly disguised. The lighthouse is Godrevy, which is one that's on the Cornish coast, which is where she spent her childhood summers with her family. And you can feel the ache of that childhood on almost every single page. And I think, like many of her novels, To the Lighthouse resists plot summaries. What really matters, and has always mattered to Woolf, is the emotional texture, the movement of time, the quiet, half-lived lives. Mrs. Ramsay, perhaps her most, luminous character, is absolutely a tribute to Virginia's mother, a presence that I think binds her family not through power, but through grace. It's one of the most moving portraits, I think, in modern literature. And then there's Mrs. Dalloway, perhaps my personal favorite, because it's set over a single June day, and it begins with Clarissa Dalloway buying flowers for a party. That's the action. But inside that walk through London, a life unfolds. Past loves return to memory, regrets stir, and as she ambles across the city, she meets Septimus Smith, a shell-shocked veteran who's unraveling in his own world of silence. Clarissa's world is ordered, it's elegant. Septimus's is burning. Woolf connects them not necessarily by plot, but by theme. Grief, memory, the unbearable fragility of being. It's breathtaking. Okay, but now let's return to Virginia's life just for a moment. She remained married to Leonard Woolf until the end, but theirs was never a closed emotional circle. And I think one of the most important relationships of hers was with Vita Sackville-West. Vita was electric. She was a writer, she was a modernist gardener, she was married to diplomat Harold Nicholson, but unapologetically free in love. And she brought an immense amount of color into Virginia's life. And they exchanged a cascade of letters, funny, tender, passionate. Their affair was very real. And though it mellowed into friendship, it left a lasting imprint. Vita's writing was wildly popular, especially in America. And Virginia, ever the perfectionist, felt that sting. Her diaries from that period are laced with dry wit and very mild jealousy. She admired Vita's charisma, but also saw her work as, I think, flashy and kind of lacking depth. Still, that relationship mattered. Vita reached parts of Virginia that Leonard couldn't. She opened her up, both emotionally and creatively, and inspired one of Woolf's most playful and I think daring novels, Orlando. Orlando is a time-traveling, gender-bending, love letter. Orlando follows a protagonist who actually lives for centuries and changes sex midway. And it's fantastical, it's mischievous, it's radical. And Woolf actually dedicated it to Vita. And I think beneath the whimsy, it's a bold rebellion against patriarchal lineage and rigid identity. And it's a book that Woolf could only have written, sparked by a love that she could only have felt. And of course, that relationship then made me think about Leonard, and did he know? Did he know about Virginia's love for women, for Vita? And if he did he mind? The truth, I think, like their marriage, defies easy explanation. There's been so much speculation, over the years, the decades, about whether their relationship was ever actually consummated, whether it was ever more than a partnership than a romance. But I don't think it matters. I think what's clear is this: it worked, and it worked bloody well. Leonard supported her with unwavering care. He nurtured her writing, he protected her through the breakdowns, and more importantly, he gave her space emotionally, intellectually, sexually to be who she needed to be. Their marriage, though unconventional, actually mattered deeply. And in the final letter that she left him before her death, Virginia actually wrote, "No two people could have been happier than we have been." And that to me is a line that's full of sincerity, gratitude, and peace. Her life, however, was never free from pain. Her mental illness shadowed her from her 20s. The cycles were absolutely brutal. Manic bursts of energy followed by silence, collapse, then despair. And of course, Leonard was always vigilant, managing her routine and shielding her from the stimuli, I think, that both sparked and overwhelmed her imagination. He moved them out of London to Richmond, as I mentioned, hoping quiet would actually help her. But of course, that wasn't what she wanted. Virginia loved London. She loved the noise, the pace, the crowds. And I think in Richmond, she often felt exiled, restless, and probably disconnected. Eventually, of course, they found a compromise. They returned to London. They also bought a country home called Monk's House in Rodmill in Sussex. It's still there. You can visit it. And in many ways, Monk's House became her sanctuary. It was here that she could hear birds. There was quiet. There were trees, a space for her to breathe. And I think it was here also that her life settled into a rhythm. London's energy and Sussex's stillness. Both landscapes actually found their way into her writing. In the city, her characters move through the crowds in memory. In the country, time slows. And what you find is that nature actually becomes the mirror. And then her final chapter. In 1941, Virginia had just finished Between the Acts, a layered lyrical novel kind of haunted by the specter of war. But she was deeply anxious about it. At the last moment, she actually tried to stop its publication. Her doubts about the book, about herself, they were raw and very familiar to anyone who's battled mental illness. Look, she'd survived breakdowns before. She'd even survived suicide attempts, but this was very different. The Blitz was battering London, her beloved London. The world was at war again, and the storm, I think, inside her was rising to a point of no return. And then one March morning, she walked into the River Ouse near Monk's House, and she died. It's hard not to ache at that, because the truth is, her final years had been so full of life. She was still writing, she was still searching. She just finished a biography of her friend Roger Fry, the art critic and painter who had introduced post-impressionism to Britain. Interestingly, his 1910 exhibition had absolutely stunned Edwardian audiences and changed everything for Virginia and Vanessa. And what it taught them was that representation wasn't mimicry. It was mood, emotion, pulse. That belief, that art should actually reach beyond likeness to something essential, I think also became central to Woolf's fiction. She didn't want to describe life. She wanted to feel it on the page and for her readers to feel it on the page. And I think even at the end, she was doing just that. Thinking of Fry actually turned her inward again, back to her childhood home at 22 Hyde Park Gate, back to the shadows and the flickers of memory. And she began a very deeply personal memoir called A Sketch of the Past. And I think it's one of her most revealing works. It's almost a meditation, not just on memory, but on how memory behaves, how it twists, how it strikes suddenly, how it stores pain. And she writes about her childhood, her griefs, and her ghosts. And through it all, one thread remains completely constant: honesty. Honesty in art, honesty in love, in thought, honesty even when it hurts. Those final years were in many ways a complete paradox, marked by fear, yet also full of life. She was afraid of war, she was afraid of rejection, and she was afraid of her own mind turning against her. And still, she kept writing, dreaming, experimenting, if you like. The creative fire never went out. I think it burned right to the end. Which brings us to the question, doesn't it? How should we remember Virginia Woolf? I think the word feminist comes up again and again, and probably rightly so. Her essays, A Room of One's Own and Three Guineas, aren't just important, they're foundational, they're fierce, and they're funny. In A Room of One's Own, she asks a deceptively simple question: what does a woman need to write fiction? Her answer: a room of her own and 500 a year. And it's become iconic. But the deeper truth comes out when she imagines Shakespeare's sister, equally brilliant, denied an education, forbidden to dream. And so she vanishes, forgotten. It's a devastating metaphor for how history has silenced women and continues to try and silence women. I mean, my God, look what's happening in the US right now. Banning A Handmaid's Tale. Unbelievable. Three Guineas, written later, is sharper still. Woolf actually links the oppression of women to the structures that lead nations into war. She questions patriotism, loyalty. As a woman, she writes, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the entire world. That is an incredibly bold, unflinching cry. And it still rings today with the clarity of protest when you see what's happening in our world. So, would she have called herself a feminist? In spirit, absolutely, without question. The label may have meant something different then, but her work is actually steeped in feminist insight. She knew what she was doing, pulling back the curtain on power, privilege, the barriers that kept women from thinking, writing, and just being. And she did it not with anger, but with elegance, humor, and a razor-sharp style. But of course, legacy, when you think about it, means reckoning with the whole person. Woolf absolutely had blind spots. In her diaries, her letters, even her fiction, there were moments that now read as, I suppose, elitist, even cruel, especially around, class and race. Yes, she could be flippant. Yes, she could be snobbish. But what stands out is her complete self-awareness. She often caught herself kind of mid-thought, questioning, correcting, probing, doubting. But she evolved and she tried to understand. And in that, I think she remains one of the most, for use of a better word, alive writers that we have ever had. Not because she offered perfect answers, because she didn't, but because she never stopped asking the better questions. Her words, I think, still resonate because they come from someone who believed fiercely, urgently, that truth actually matters. Truth actually matters. Just mull that over, guys. Virginia Woolf sometimes wrote things in her diaries that are frankly appalling, especially around class and race. But I think what's striking and deeply human is how often she caught herself. She questioned her own reflexes. She wondered where they came from. That kind of self-awareness, I think, was very rare for her time, and I think remains even rarer today. Her essay, Am I a Snob?, is a case in point. It's sharp, it's funny, it's completely honest. And she faces the criticism often leveled at the Bloomsbury group, that they were elite, that they were out of touch, perhaps even hypocritical. After all, how can you write about the need for a room of one's own while relying on, domestic servants to clean it? She saw herself and her circle as products of a particular moment. They tried to live very differently. They tried to think honestly. They loved freely, and they rejected stuffy hypocrisies of Victorian life. But she knew they didn't always succeed. She knew history at some stage might remember them not as revolutionaries, but as very flawed kind of stepping stones. And yet still, I think she hoped for a little grace. She wanted future generations to understand, not to idolize them, but to see what it meant to sit in drawing rooms, to speak openly, to write as women for women, and to believe, however briefly, that the world could be changed by conversation, by art, and by love. And I think only a woman can do that. That gaze towards the future, that instinct to write with us in mind, is part of what makes Woolf extraordinary. She knew we'd be watching. She hoped we'd ask the hard questions, and she believed her work could actually hold up to scrutiny, and I think it does. So the last question I had as I came to the end of this research was, why do people still turn to Virginia Woolf more than 80 years after her death? And I think it's multifaceted. There are so many reasons why we still read Virginia Woolf. First, the prose. I mean, it's daring, it's fluid, it's extracting. Reading her is like stepping into the current of someone's mind. You don't just observe her characters, you actually become them. You end up thinking their thoughts. You feel their shifts in perception. You move through their memories. And when you surface, the world is always a slightly different place. And I think that's her gift. Not information, but actual transformation. Then there's her courage. She actually tackled the big questions. What is a self? What does it mean to live, to create, to break under pressure? Why do women need space to think? And why does war keep happening? She didn't flinch. She went to the edge of her understanding and sometimes her sanity to explore those questions. And then there are her diaries. We didn't really touch on them. I mentioned them, but I think they might be the most intimate, revealing work that she ever produced. And she wrote nearly daily for most of her life. She wrote with total frankness, reflections on friends, on books, on what she'd written that day. They're raw, searching, sometimes cruel, and they're often tender. And she absolutely knew that they would be read someday, which gives them a strange kind of, theatrical kind of honesty. Reading them, I have to say, is like sitting beside her. Not the polished writer, but the real person who I think was brilliant and flawed and curious and thinking in real time. And that's what Woolf gives us, closeness. Not just to a mind, but to a life. A woman who lived through 2 world wars, the rise of fascism, and the fight for women's rights, and who met it all not with silence, but with words. So if you're thinking she sounds incredible, look, she absolutely is. And if you're now thinking I'd actually like to read her, here's my suggestion. For nonfiction, begin with A Room of One's Own, because it's lucid and it's funny and it's very personal and it's a perfect doorway into her thinking. For fiction, I would recommend Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. One takes you through a single day in London, which I absolutely love, and the other, across the sea of memory. Both of them are absolute masterpieces, and both of them, I guarantee, will shift you in a certain way. Virginia Woolf, I think, still speaks. Not because she shouted, but because she listened to time, to people, to the quiet truths flickering through a life. And in doing so, she left behind something enduring, a literature of depth, of beauty, I think of radical honesty, one that's still teaching us, one that still, I think, has very much more to say. Thanks for listening in, guys, and I will look forward to chatting to you next week. Bye for now.